Every bit as direct and unmediated, if you will, and as spontaneous and as radical, or if not more so, than those by Derain and Flamenc. And yet, as far as I know, Matisse hasn't been called an anarchist.
Actually, that's not true.
Or Braque, I suppose, the same thing. I mean, I just wonder whether there's a danger that any modern artist working in a modern medium or idiom is to be called an anarchist.
Could I speak to that?
Yes, Linda, please. Oh, is that up? I think it's not.
Oh, I was just going to say that if we can use anarchist in a most metaphorical way, meaning somebody who rejects the doxa and rejects the rules of, say, composition and painting of the time, then Degas really does qualify metaphorically. I mean, he's cantankerous, but I think his actual practice is extraordinarily undermining. I mean, he's a systematic underminer when he writes all those notes about let's see things in ways they've never been seen before, directly. He's implying. And I know I walk past the Pantheon every morning during this summer. And he said, I want to stand in a corner of the Pantheon and look up from that corner. And he did a squiggly drawing that you don't even know is architecture. It looks nothing like what you think of as the Pantheon. But he wanted you to see it new, really in the Russian formalist sense. He was trying to make people see it new. He wanted to destroy the conventional choreography of ballet, far from being an artist who represents the ballet. He is the destroyer of choreography of the ballet. Since when does he ever show you where you want your ideal seat, front center? He's hanging from the rafters, looking down on people, distorting them, contorting them. Sure, he does wonderful direct drawings of ballet dancers, but when it comes to the art of ballet, he is really, destroying it in a certain sense and making you see it new. And from angles that you really have to be hanging from a trapeze to get at. So I think he is the ideal metaphorical anarchist in that sense of vision.
I think you raise a really important problem about how you can distinguish between the radical features of a lot of modernist art and then artists who specifically view their modernism as an expression of their anarchism or serving a sort of not just a political vision, but actually becoming a tool for the transformation of society. And that's, in my book, that's exactly what I was trying to get at. Just a footnote, there is a little bit of evidence Matisse was touching on this world quite voluntarily. Hilary Sperling cites a story about Matisse actually donating money for political, more or less people on the run, and that he once a year would meet somebody that he never knew who it was and hand over cash for this purpose of protecting people who were, political refugees. And I found that really fascinating. And of course, he does go down to Saint-Tropez and work with Signac and Cross in their kind of anarchist Mediterranean ideal artists cooperative. That overstates the case a little bit, but he was very comfortable being there, even though it's brief, and he goes on then into his own culture. I would simply say there'd be a great dissertation in Matisse and politics just to sort out whatever his thinking was, because it hasn't. There's been a little bit done by Roger Benjamin on colonialism and Matisse, but there'd be a lot more, I think, to think about.
To add on to just what you're saying, before going to Saint-Tropez, he shares before going to Saint-Tropez, Matisse lives with a flatmate, a schoolmate, Georges Pissarro, the second son, who's also a pronounced anarchist. He goes to see Dad because George introduces him to the old Pissarro. So he was definitely comfortable within that group.
Yeah. Thank you. I'm going to just take the moderator's point to answer one thing about Linda's point, and that is just that there's nothing more disruptive destructive, disorienting than capitalism. And indeed, modernity and modernization is all about the destruction of the existing means of production and social relations. It's all kinds. So it isn't an anarchist perspective to be violent and destructive and disrupt, et cetera, but it's something part of modernity broadly. So I just to challenge again for Degas even.
I just want to say that in art, people did not like you with your distance, associate those things. They thought that was part of a great tradition, that you showed the Pantheon from the front, and you showed incidents as they were. And that, I don't think Degas was thinking, oh, I'm being a capitalist, I'll destroy everything, any more than he was thinking, I'll be an anarchist. He was just thinking, everyone's done this. This is a new thing that I want to do.
Right.
It's being modern.
Right. Another question from the audience? Oh, yes, please, I'm sorry.
In terms of the second question that Mark asked about the nature of anarchism, I think the one thing that unites all the schools of anarchism is how can society be arranged in such a way that each individual is free to express their uniqueness, free to develop their own potentiality. And as I said, there are a variety of schools of anarchism, but that question is common to all. The individualist anarchists, interestingly enough, were all religious, at least in antebellum America. And a lot of the anarchist discourse, for example, Godwin, comes from the dissenting Protestant tradition. And part of what's at the root here is the idea, Protestants wanted to remove any impediment to a direct relationship with God. Godwin, in many respects, can be thought of as dissenting theology without the God. Proudhon comes along and develops a mutualist form of anarchism where he makes a distinction between possession and property. Possession is our toothbrush, our bed, our clothes, and so forth, and he has no problem with that. It's property, where capitalism comes in and does not return to the worker the full value of the worker's effort. And mutualism, is kind of the dominant ideology among the working classes in the mid-19th century up until the Paris Commune. Bakunin, of course, comes in and introduces an idea of anarcho-collectivism, where the principle is from each according to the work done. In other words, whoever works, you get the full value back. Reclus, during the Paris Commune, recognized that that's not a good formulation, that many people are left out and consequently would not be able to develop their individuality, their uniqueness, and their full potential. And Reclus began to develop this idea of anarcho-communism. Kropotkin and Matisse and others get the credit for it, but in fact, it's Reclus who initially suggests the notion of anarcho-communism. And Kropotkin's work, in many respects, is simply the further elaboration and the popularization of Reclus' ideas. But anarcho-communism uses the principle from each according to his ability to each according to need. And then, of course, the syndicalist movement rooted these principles in the labor movement, and there is also a religious wing of anarchism, primarily through Tolstoy, but also among the American anarchists. So that's just a brief thumbnail of the different schools of thought in anarchism, but the one thing that unites them all is this question: how can society be arranged in such a way that every individual is free, every individual can develop their own potentiality and express their uniqueness? Okay.
Robin, simply because you had already responded once to this set of questions, I want to open it up one more time to the audience so that it's like a parliamentary thing where everybody gets to speak once, but not twice until, although... Is that a political system? That's a good point. Another question, yeah. Excuse me, so that you get a microphone there.
Hello. Yes, I was struck by your comments about individual movement against everything else, and I'm struck by the contemporary, what I would call digital anarchy that exists. we are at a time, I think, where it's all happening. Every person can be the anarchist today in the digital world. WikiLeaks, just one little example, but every human being is out there. They can be, they can create, they can exist, and move down these paths that we've been talking about. So, and your talk has stimulated that thought in me, and I want to thank you for that. And any comment related to that, I appreciate.
Thank you. Please.
Thank you. Well, as you heard from Stephen, I'm completing a book with a co-author, David Carrier, precisely on this kind of topic. Notion of wild art, it's called, and it's art outside the system, and digital art is extremely important, but so are sandcastles, so is ice art, so it's all the stuff that we never, ever, ever discuss in a classroom, in a museum situation, or in an auction house, you know, things of no value to the art system, but that have great values to individuals that are billions of them, which are outside the system. You know.
Another answer to this question, Robin?
I just have a quick, this is back to Mark again, and then to just build a little bit on what Dana said. The one word that didn't come up in your wonderful summary is just the word authority. I mean, for me, the touchstone that all anarchist thought is built upon, it doesn't matter really who you're talking about, it's anti-authoritarian. And I mean, the freedom to be the individual is one thing, but it's also this freedom from. It's not just freedom to, it's freedom from authority. And of that, I think that's really what Volatone is all about. But it's also, I really think it's what underlies most anarchist thinking. And I mean, I'm not going to dominate with that anymore, but I think that's a big part of it.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And, Josiah Warren is America's Proudhon, but he predates Proudhon. And the concept that was central to Warren's philosophy was self-sovereignty. Mill adopts it on Liberty. But that is the core, that self-sovereignty. And any kind of authority that impinges upon that self-sovereignty is a kind of invasion. And that's what anarchists resist.
Yeah, a quick one, and then I want to
Isn't there something kind of naive about that idea? If we know Freudianism at all, what is this self, propulsion and so on? We've internalized the superego. I mean, look at half the stuff that you see on the tube. Does it seem to you very individual and very fighting authority or whatnot? It's, my date thinks my behind is nicer than your day, etc. I mean, it's often of a total banality, and is like from reading popular trash or from other things which have been uncritically internalized. In other words, authority is not just something out there. It has been built into all of our brains and feelings and hearts, conventions, low and high. I think the notion that we are free, I mean, it's a lovely idea. But what do we mean by that exactly? Doesn't that have to be examined? I think at the end of the 19th and early 20th century, these ideas had something going for them, but Freud and others, Marx knew about ideology. I mean, we were imbued with ideology, which is as authoritarian as any dictator. In fact, what is inside us, what is unconsciously within us, is in some way more insidious.
All the while, we're believing we're being individual, in other words. Right.
I just want to have that happy touch.
Let's see. Should I saw Alan
Well,
taking the
I was
mic.
just going to mention, as far as the internet goes and anarchism, the internet really has transformed anarchist modes of communication and mutual aid and so on in various ways. If you think about new technologies in relation to anarchism, just think of what happened in Seattle and the way in which the cell phone and other modes of technological innovation were seized by anarchists and used to ends that disrupted the very people who'd created some of those capacities of communication, like the US military, for example. There's a wonderful book called The Anarchist in the Library, which looks at the decentralizing potentialities of the internet. and they are there. And as an anarchist and someone who participates in organizing and communication and so on, I'm a before internet and after the internet anarchist, and I can tell you that the internet has opened up all sorts of possibilities and new modes of freedom, I would say, and they are there in that technology as a potentiality. But of course, then look at the other side of things, the way in which the internet's also enhanced and facilitated really scary surveillance technologies, really frightening ways in which the state is impinging on our everyday lives, expanding its capacities for monitoring us and controlling us and criminalizing us, criminalizing our ideas.
Let me just say this other question before we take more. Yes. No. Could you talk into the microphone directly, or at least maybe it's not turned on? Just talk into it, hold it close to your mouth.
Closer? Is that okay?
Perfect.
I want to turn it away from anarchism for a moment and talk about friendship, because I loved the exhibition that Monsieur Pissarro did at MoMA. But I wondered why it wasn't called Pissarro and Cézanne instead of Cézanne and Pissarro, because I so credit your grandfather with saving Cézanne as an artist. And I was a docent at the Guggenheim, and I would show people how Pissarro in 1873 painted, and then how Cézanne painted, and how Cézanne changed. And then you could go across and look at a Picasso landscape at Céret, and then I was agreeing with Bill Rubin that, in fact, Cézanne created, or not created, but certainly stimulated Cubism. My real question, though, is, Cézanne also said that Pissarro would have been known as a great painter if he had just kept on painting the way he did when they were working together. And that makes me wonder, I know that an awful lot of his work was destroyed when the house in Louvciennes was vandalized, but do you have work from before then to sort of, is there enough work still extant so that you can do a whole survey of his work and see the changing styles?
Okay. Very, very Pissarro-related question. Well, thank you for your comments about the MoMA show. You heard how our wonderful host described me as not as a MoMA bride, but as a MoMA spy. And so, no, it was, in truth, the point of that exhibition at MoMA was to examine the source of this artist who is known not only at MoMA, but who is basically regarded as the founder of modernism. You know, you come into MoMA, the first thing you see is the Great Bather of 1885, excuse me. So where did this come from? Well, that was an attempt to explain a little bit the story. But so go back to your story, but to your quote. The quote is actually, indeed, Cézanne says, something like Pissarro would have surpassed it all had he continued to paint as he did in Louvciennes, which is the point where Cézanne comes in, takes that painting and goes and does the copy. You saw the two paintings at MoMA. But the odd thing is that the quote you're referring to by Pissarro is, sorry, it's a little detailed here for those of you who are not interested in the 60s, I'm sorry, but he says, Pissarro, we came back to Louvciennes and we found that my studio was completely ransacked. I lost 1,500 paintings. And I think Pissarro is not good at math. He's not very detailed when it comes to figures. He often gets dates wrong and so on. 1,500 paintings is completely impossible biologically. His entire oeuvre, as we know it today, consists of 1,512 paintings from 1860 to 1903. So do the calculation yourself. He couldn't have done as much in 30 years from 70 to 1900 as he would have done in 5 or 8 years. So something is missing here, and I think it just probably added 1 0 too many. But the early works are fascinating. I agree with you.
Okay, another question? Yes, Richard.
Also, I apologize because this is also a Pissarro-related question, though maybe there can be a broader answer to it. And it has to do with the the question of whether Pissarro's paintings are anarchic paintings and what the beholders of them, the owners of them, would have made of that. Now, I wonder if they could talk a little bit about what was the market for his mature pictures, who was buying them, and did they get it? Did they understand the anarchic meaning of these pictures, and what would those owners have made of that fact?
Well, I think that a lot of his work did not sell well during his lifetime, and just when he started to have them be sold is, when he started the Neoimpressionism, which we've heard did not sell well. Duran Ruel was his dealer who, helped, but he was always in arguments with Duran Ruel about the prices and getting them sold. But I would think that his, and maybe Joaquin, maybe you can talk about it, but that his buyers for the most part were not aware of his anarchism.
Can I just say one thing about that? From the perspective of Impressionist painting in the middle 1870s, I wrote about the politics of the naming of the Impressionist group 30 years ago or something. And one thing that's to be observed about that phenomenon and subsequent ones is that, in a sense, you don't really ever have radical painters or radical paintings. You have radical interpretations. And those interpretations are only possible at particular moments in time. So in the context of the Commune and the years immediately thereafter, with Paris still under martial law, and certain kinds of artistic manifestations would be read as, in the language of the time, intransigent, which was referred to, which was a term that was used to relate to the Spanish anarchists of 1870. And therefore, it was the suggestion that these artists are all indeed in league with these radicals over the border, and there's a danger to the body politic in France. And similarly, of course, in the 1890s, during the period of the anarchist outrages, as they were called, works like these, I should think, would be interpreted as potentially anarchist works of art. Now, of course, the way we measure this is, I'm saying this for the audience, even though I'm looking at you, the way we measure this is by trying to gather information about interpretations of that moment. So we'll read critical reviews, accounts of buyers of works of art in order to see whether the anarchism as we describe it is merely implicit or whether it's in some way explicit, visible to the audiences. Now, particular cases, you all here who have been working on Pissarro more recently may be able to speak to whether in individual circumstances patrons thought they were buying anarchist paintings.
If you don't mind to add something. There is a letter which is interesting, which answers directly your point. In fact, I wanted to discuss it also with Professor Ward here, because as you pointed out, Grave, forgive my French pronunciation, but Grave, recruits them. That's the word you used. He recruits a whole bunch of artists. Luce is perhaps the foremost and very willing to illustrate the cause of the people. And he's more than one covers of La Plume or La Révolte is done by Luce. But at some point, Grave turns to Pissarro and says, hey, old man, it's your turn. I mean, it's one thing to hear you discuss our ideas in cafes and so on. We'd like a drawing. We'd like to publish something. And Pissarro writes this rather irate, frustrated letter again to Lucien and says, what does he mean? What is he asking me to do? How can I illustrate the cause? Doesn't he know that my art doesn't illustrate any cause? My art is not illustrative. And he's again here, again the very idea of art being ancillary to any kind of message, be it to defend the sentimental oppression of the poor, oppressed people, of the workers, be it the great cause of the liberation of the people. Art is not about that. Art has to be free from any kind of system, including perhaps the anarchistic system. And I find what is very interesting in the different talks you heard is precisely the way, and your talk, Stephen, was brilliant about this. I mean, the flocks, and you can look at the flocks with or without the interpretation. If you don't know that those flocks of sheep, for instance, the great neo-impressionist paintings are being taken to the slaughterhouse, it's a beautiful, lovely, bucolic painting, but none of this kind of heavy message attached to it, unless you've done the work that Stephen has done.
Anyone else wish to speak?
I was just recalling that in those letters to Lucien, Pissarro was also very critical of some of the people who buy his paintings. and talks about them as bourgeois, and therefore there's every indication that he himself, looking at the people who are buying his work, was recognizing the gulf, the political gulf between then and himself, which enhances the mystery of where the politics resides and how the artist, the artist is in a sense in a dialogue with the buyers in that instance, in private, which is not very complimentary.
Yeah, let me also just say in response to you and to Stephen, I personally believe you cannot overestimate the power of the art critics when it comes to this, because I think of Fénéon and then the critics who were anarchists around him, and they're the ones who really imposed anarchist meaning on many neo-impressionist paintings. Now, and those are the ones that I'm most familiar with, but I think that that's where a lot of the radicalizing of these paintings comes from. It's from the critical voices, and those are amplified, at certain periods of time. I think between, let's say, 1889 and maybe 1896, there's a great deal of that going on. I often wonder, without those critical voices, how would you ever have seen a painting by Maximilian Loos, a painting of the sun at night? Would you ever have seen a painting like that as radicalized? I don't think so. So it's a very important issue when you're looking at these. I can't speak to Pissarro here, but...
Richard, you raised obviously a very fruitful question for everyone. Did you want to follow up, or do you feel we've...
No, I wanted to, I know that Pissarro had difficulty selling his pictures until late in his life, and I imagine that those buyers would have been wealthy bourgeois, and I just thought there might be a kind of ironic.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a bit ironic that the primary audience were luxury objects.
Yeah.
Or were they luxury objects, which could also
Well, that's right.
Anarchic.
Right. Well, that's been, of course, an issue of lots of radical artists, and in the case of William Morris, who was much admired by the Pissarro family, is a good case in point. Here he was producing decorations of all kinds, wallpapers, very expensively made, for an elite audience, while he himself was the leading socialist writer and a theoretician and activist in late Victorian London. But he saw them in two respects. One is that he could produce in his workshop a kind of model community of laborers doing fully integrative work where they take pleasure in their own work. And secondly, you could produce in an object you can model an aesthetic of the future. And after all, you can't be a revolution in one person. You still have to make a living. You still have to do what you have to do. And all these artists are recognizing and struggling with a world in which it's impossible for them to get by unless they produce works that can be in some way appreciated and sold. And Pissarro saw this, of course, very clearly and was tormented by it.
Pissarro, he also produced cheaper prints.
Yes.
Especially the Marxism you see in the last gallery exhibition, which presumably would have had a much wider audience.
Yes, there's an opportunity sometimes to do that around the margins. Yeah. And I'm not sure how much time we have left, but maybe one more question, and then who would like to be our... It's a nice honor for the person to be the last speaker. Ivan, you looked as if you were on the point of speech there. Are you?
I'll take that honor, even though it's a dubious one. I want to ask a question. Wonderful papers, thanks very much. I want to ask a question about a word. Peasant. Terribly loaded term. Maoist triumphalism to term of abuse. What's the effect of that word on the way in which people view the things that we see upstairs? It's all over the place.
Yeah. This has been a kind of bête noire for me, the indiscriminate use of the word peasant in art historical studies. Because after all, it has the connotation of somebody who is bonded to the land as a medieval serf. It's used more broadly just to mean an agricultural worker, someone who doesn't own the land in which they are working. It also means a small-scale farmer in various usages. So, it obfuscates much more than it reveals, particularly for modern audiences who have no notion of it. Instead, it means something that's lowly, banal. You'll say it about somebody else who comes in your house and has bad manners, a mere peasant, you might say, if you want to be really superior about it. Another response to that? or-
Yes, no, I just to amplify what you're saying. Also the word used by Pissarro, of course, is paysan, which only differs slightly. It has exactly the same connotations, the same loaded, very negative connotations in French. However, the term itself, when you hear it in French, you hear the word pays, where it comes from, which is a guy from the country, from the place. The side. And I wanted to just go back to what you heard before about the distinction between anarchism and Marxism. Marxism is essentially being a city-centered ideology versus anarchism, which is much more a rural-based. The rural model is taken and held up by most, if not all, the anarchist theoreticians as the enviable one, whereas the Marxists, as you know very well, look down upon the country. And I think that's for Pissarro, there's no question that the paysan is not someone to look down upon. In fact, there's a letter where he describes himself as a paysan. I think somebody quoted that letter, if I'm not wrong. So, for him, it's very much a praise rather than a derogatory term.
Yeah, just one more comment, just to be last, and keep it brief because we're
Right,
running out of time.
of course. Of course, the role of peasantry in revolutionary theory was starkest in the dialogue between Bakunin and Marx. Marx saw peasants as basically potatoes in a sack. The only thing that united them was their common condition. Kropotkin and Bakunin were both noblemen, and they experienced, particularly Kropotkin, who had a very bad relationship with his parents and his stepmother. He spent a lot of time among the peasants on his father's plantation, or what missing the word right now. But for Kropotkin and for Bakunin, what they saw most important about peasants was their mutual aid, that they banded together to help each other in their conditions of oppression.
Okay, I think that's we're out of time. So I thank you all for your attention and your good questions.